Good evening. It's 7:30 p.m. on July 28th, 2021. Have done something. I've just done something, which is only the second time I've done this, which is read a opinion from former Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, and this one was Lynch versus U.S. And among the things it discusses in this opinion is a consideration of the war risk insurance program and determination of the war risk insurance program for a specific policyholder. Not only that, but it also has opinion, or it has been put on the record a specific perspective on the identification of pension benefits as a form of gratuity and separate and distinct from a contract with the government. And among the things this particular opinion does is discuss pensions from a legal perspective, how pensions legally are entitled to have certain kinds of projections, and also have a specific consideration of what is a contract, and has a specific manner of discussing contract that I had not encountered before, but that I believe has a lot of validity for other considerations, and may speak, for instance, to how a life insurance policy is distinct from pension benefits, and also how a pension fund, including a pension fund awarded to military veterans, is distinct from, for instance, getting some form of end of life care or something akin to Social Security. Now, I'm going to be evaluating this and moving forward on it in my own accord from that particular consideration. But, in the course of that happening, something else has come up, and it's important to distinguish. I just want to bring up 3 points and then finish with a couple comments. First of all, one of the things that have been happening here in Texas is under the Texas Veterans Code. One of the matters it discusses is an understanding of bonuses for veterans. This is something I've had a problem with for a considerable amount of time. What's considered a bonus? And what are considered entitlements as a form of some sort of benefit or some sort of acknowledgement of the service that veterans have provided? This is specifically relevant because there was presumably a constitutional amendment that was passed in the state of Texas, ostensibly approved by the voters, but which I contend should never have made it to the voters, regarding this consideration of providing a charitable assistance regarding tax waivers for partially disabled veterans when it came to housing access. Now, my understanding is that this is actually part of a system connected to awards of veterans benefits going all the way back to the beginning of Texas, specifically considering veterans from the Texas Revolution. However, the specific manner in which that particular constitutional amendment was put into effect and what the implications are completely unconstitutional. It had no constitutional basis. And it's been very concerning to me why it is that nobody that believes they're qualified to call themselves a veteran in Texas has protested and has actually made the point of asserting and making sure it is on the record that actual veterans would completely repudiate the implications of an unconstitutional amendment being allowed to be promulgated in their name. It is akin to what was allowed to masquerade as law in 2017 when they discussed another kind of tax waiver, which was the tax waiver on the spouse of a first responder killed in action. A tax waiver on the homestead of the spouse of a first responder killed in action was completely unacceptable. It was completely unconstitutional. And I contend that what it does is violate the Constitution of Texas in a number of ways, including the privileging of sex, which, even within the specific kind of sectarian privilege that it accords, is considered by those who are part of the internal controls, or rather, those who would be in charge of assuring against any abuse of the particular sectarian tendencies, from it being allowed to replace constitutional process outside of the appropriate context. And that's exactly what it did. And not only did that specific alleged constitutional amendment set in motion processes accorded on par with that, but it also allowed for a justification of other things even more hideous, like what was recently passed regarding tax waivers regarding service animals, right? So I bring that up because these are two of the major concerns in regards to that. But then the other concern has to do with considerations of who is actually qualified to identify themselves as a veteran. In this country, we have selective service that presumably is only required of men. But there have been efforts to address legislative changes that would then make women also required to engage in selective service. Now, I'm somebody that when I was about to go to college was not informed that there was a case pending before the Supreme Court of the United States about granting women equal access to military academies on par with young men. Nobody told me about this, even though I came from a military environment. And I contend that had I known, I might have made a different life course decision. But in some ways, it may well have been a blessing because I now know that if I had gone through the process of going to an accredited educational facility, including potentially a military academy, which, if nothing else, requires a congressional sponsorship in order to attend, and then had signed up and become an officer and attempted to serve in the military, I would not have accepted Bill Clinton as my commander in chief. It would have been a moral repugnancy for me to have accepted the kind of sexual abuse of power he was allowed to get away with, and the failure of Congress to do something to prevent against that being a standard that was supposed to represent the people, including up until this day, would have been completely contestable to me. And it would have been a violation of my understanding of who I was and what would have allowed for me to justify myself being in that kind of a service role to serve under the command authority of Bill Clinton. And unfortunately, from that time forward, because of a refusal to have a rectification of that, any efforts to say that it was okay to allow for some sort of decision appropriating me for or in connection with a military outlay, including one that would reassign me or try to reprogram me because I showed a certain kind of extemporaneous leadership, including in applying an ethical criticism regarding abuse of power, including military power. And so it would be okay to allow for me to be made into a military asset, but then loaned out to a foreign country, including a foreign country identified as hostile, is also equally repudiable. Now we're in a situation where in 2016, I was asked as part of a training program, as part of a mock interview, very directly, well, with your bearing and all of these things, why didn't you go into the military? You might have done really well in the military. Why didn't you go in the military? I answered honestly. My understanding is that by virtue of my honest answer and the response I got, which is if anybody ever asked you that question, you should never tell anybody that. That's not true. And I've contended to this time that is absolutely not true. If you would not trust the chain of command, then who are you to pretend like you would so you could get inside? And this is a question I think a lot of people are going to have to grapple with very, very soon. If you do not trust the chain of command, then what are you doing saying you would accept it? And that brings up a question of, well, then who is actually qualified to call themselves a military veteran? And after how long? Now, one of the things that was revealed in this opinion by Louis Brandeis, which was an old opinion by Justice Brandeis, is something that has been brought to our attention right now at this time. We are now more than 35 years down the road from a capital outlay process associated with military pension benefits that was begun in the 1980s. And the understanding was the outlay was actually for 40 years. But they had only actually budgeted in regards to understanding outcome to meet the obligations for 35. Nobody in the civilian leadership or the military leadership has said anything about this. We've had some discussion on debt ceiling and how a debt ceiling may impact military pension benefits, but that was how long ago? Coming up on around the time when people would have been having to make very, very substantial decisions about what to do with understanding that we were coming to the end of that 35-year term, and nobody had presented a reasonable consideration of what we were going to do about that. And I contend that what has happened instead is that part and parcel with the crimes of the Affordable Care Act is there has been illegal liens placed on military veterans, including in the form of addressing or identifying them as having some sort of disability, including a mental disability, including connected to some form of trauma, and then allowing for them to be put into systems where their actual skills and expertise are harvested, as well as what would otherwise be availed of by them and their families in regards to pension benefits, so that it can be recirculated to people who have absolutely no intention of being responsible with it. And so if you're going to tell me that I'm getting cut off from veterans benefits, then let me ask you, how many veterans were secretly put on some sort of telehealth prescription in the last year as part of the alleged COVID-19 relief? How many veterans were informed that they were going to be provided with telehealth services in their home as part of their veterans benefits? Is that what you mean? I contend it actually is. I don't think there's been anything actually authentic or genuine about what has happened with the so-called veterans benefits packages since it was allowed for Congress to make the determination that they were going to keep responses regarding veterans' health exposure to chemical weapons during the Gulf War secret. Well, we're just not going to talk about it anymore. There were several years prior to the first Gulf War, military veterans trying to get information about exposure to chemical weapons both during Vietnam and in time frames after Vietnam, including for veterans that had service in Japan and other areas of Asia. During a time frame, there was some release of information, but at a very strategic point, it was cut off. It was no longer allowed to be public information. And what we've seen is, as that has gone along, ever increasing volumes of information are illegally mischaracterized and allowed to be called confidential. That's exactly what we got going on in Texas right now. By law, you're required to make this information available to us so we can be responsible with it. And if you refuse to provide it, the question is, why? Why are you unwilling to be responsible with the information that we are all supposed to have so we can make decisions? How are we going to trust you with the authority to represent us if you won't even tell us what you understand you're representing? These are very important questions. I apologize to anybody that feels like this might be a very assertive presentation on one hand, but on the other hand, not. We needed to be able to understand what was going on, what these processes were, and what the kind of fortifications were that we had to work with in order for us to actually accurately identify what the threats really are. If somebody's telling you you're sick and diseased and you need somebody else to take care of you, when you already have an awareness that something else is going on you're not hearing, how long and how many years are you supposed to be gaslighted before you get that clandestine communication? Yeah, we're cutting you off from veterans benefits. Excuse me. I never served under anybody's command. You had no right to have me on veterans benefits. Or did you? No, you did not. I never gave you command.